We operate on the assumption that the I is a permanent, fixed essence, but under close inspection, that seemingly solid foundation dissolves into a stream of acquired information and biological memory. Ashtavakra Gita 2.15 frames this through a specific triad: knowledge, the object that is known, and the subject or knower. The text argues that these three are not independent entities, they are relational. You cannot have a knower without an object to be known, nor can you have knowledge without a subject to hold it. Within this framework, the knower is the psychological identity we carry, a bundle of names, social roles, and memories. I am a doctor, I am a citizen, or a parent, only because I possess the information attached to those labels. Strip away that accumulated data and its sensory objects, and the psychological identity has no content left. When the knowledge and the known are removed, the conceptual knower disappears. Modern behavioral genetics arrives at a similar critique of the self, though it reaches this conclusion through biological data rather than metaphysics. This is the baseline equation of the field. It shows that human traits, the things we think make us us, are emergent properties. A genotype interacts with biological development and the environment to produce the phenotype. We are going to translate the ancient Vedantic critique of identity into the modern polygenic developmental loop, rigorously marking the line where empirical science ends and philosophy begins. Whether viewed through ancient Indian epistemology or modern gene sequencing, the concept of a totally isolated, context-free individual remains an illusion. To understand the biological self, we have to move past genetic determinism. There's no single aggression or intelligence gene. We are products of polygenic inheritance. Complex human behaviors are influenced by thousands of tiny genetic variants. No single biological variable corresponds to a fixed self. This chart tracks heritability, a statistical measure of variation between individuals attributable to genetics. But a 50% score doesn't mean half your personality is genes and half environment. Heritability describes populations, not a single person's composition. A trait being heritable does not make it unchangeable. Genetic influence is not a synonym for a fixed destiny. This aligns with the Ashtavakra Gita's principle that the word is not the thing. A behavioral label like anxious is a summary of observed data, not the underlying essence of the person. Genetic predispositions provide a biological baseline, but don't define the ultimate boundaries of the knower. Genetic predispositions function as conditional probabilities. Their impact depends entirely on the environment in which they are expressed. This is the mechanism of gene-environment interaction, or G by E. G by E means one genotype can produce two outcomes. Genotype A in high stress leads to outcome X, but in a supportive environment, outcome Y. Conversely, the exact same environment affects people differently based on their distinct genetic predispositions. This biological interplay shares a relational logic with our source text. In both, the observer cannot be defined separately from the conditions through which their experience occurs. Nature and nurture are not opposing forces. The modern scientific objective is to map how they operate together to generate the phenotype. Because genes act as conditional responses rather than a fixed script, the empirical self is an ongoing event, not a static object. The complexity deepens because genes also influence which environments we encounter. Our traits actively shape our surroundings. This is gene-environment correlation. In passive correlation, parents provide both the genetic variants and the early environment that reinforces them. In evocative correlation, an individual's genetically influenced temperament provokes specific reactions from others, effectively creating a custom social environment. This loop highlights active correlation, where individuals deliberately select environments compatible with predispositions. For example, a sensation-seeking disposition drives someone toward high-risk environments, shaping future behavior. It forms a self-reinforcing circle. Biology influences behavior, behavior alters environment, and environment feeds back into biology. The psychological concept of an independent doer of actions breaks down when the individual is shown to be a node within a self-reinforcing developmental system. We are also shaped by genes we don't even possess. This is the phenomenon of genetic nurture. Here's the pathway. A parent's genes influence the parent's behavior. That behavior creates the home environment, and that environment dictates the child's development, even if the child didn't inherit those specific genes. Genetic nurture blurs the line between the internal self and the external world. Nature is the architect of nurture. The final layer is epigenetics. Environmental conditions influence gene activity regulation without changing the underlying DNA sequence. The environment leaves a biological mark on how our code is read. We must distinguish this biological regulation from pseudoscientific claims. There is no evidence that thoughts or meditation can permanently rewrite your DNA sequence. The empirical self is a web of indirect genetic effects and epigenetic regulation, lacking a singular, immutable core. This complete behavioral genetic model shows the cascading interactions that produce the I. It is a transactional loop between biology, learning, and environment. Both modern genetics and ancient Vedanta suggest the everyday psychological person is not a fixed, isolated entity. True intellectual maturity requires recognizing the limits of our measurements and our frameworks. This table marks the strict boundary between the two fields. The bottom rows represent concepts that fall outside the reach of empirical science. While behavioral genetics maps the constraints on our behavior, it cannot prove or disprove the metaphysical claim that free will is an illusion. Ashtavakra's objective is to ask what remains when our identification with the biological machinery is transcended. He calls this niranjana, the unstained, pure awareness that observes the biological and psychological processes without being defined by them. We should not conflate these disciplines. Genetics cannot prove metaphysics, and metaphysics cannot replace genetic data. Behavioral genetics maps the conditional probabilities of the biological self. But to investigate the fundamental nature of the awareness that observes that self, we must return to philosophy.